What's up and welcome back to the channel. In this episode we've got the GTR back from media blasting. We've got a lot of work to do to this thing, so let's get started. Alright, so I just got a text that he's going to be blasting my GTR, so let's ride over there and see if I can get some footage of the process. So this is the blast nozzle. The actual media and the air comes out of that. This is what they call a dead man switch. Basically got a safety switch which controls the media coming out. They also wear these hoods, these masks that are fresh air fed, and they're also air conditioned, which actually cools them off while they're blasting, and it helps them from basically breathing all of this sandstorm that's going to be going on in here. So we're going to start by blasting the bottom side of this thing. I'm going to stand outside the booth, and we're going to try to leave the doors just open enough for me to see, because there's no windows in this paint booth. So yeah, let's watch him blast some of this thing. So this is what it looks like after he blasted on it, and you can see it's all real fresh, clean metal now. Where he was blasting and it was just paint, and the burnt stuff kind of came off really fast, and where there's seam sealer and the spray-on undercoating is kind of rubberized, so it doesn't take it off really fast. You have to spend a lot of time with the blaster trying to make that go away, but that's the look we're looking for. We're going to go ahead and get this finished up blasting, and then we'll be able to get this thing over to the shop, get the metal treated with some epoxy primer, and then we'll be able to get it painted. So let's let him get back to blasting. All right, so I got all the bolts out of this steering rack. Let's go ahead and get this thing out of the car. Oh, I just got a text, and I think I know who it's from. Let's see. Yep, it's the sandblaster, and the GTR's ready. Let's go get that thing. Alright, we got this thing back at the shop, and it looks a lot better than it did when it left. Now, I did not have him blast the outside of the panels because the heat generated from the blasting typically warps up the metal. I just had him hit the areas that were burnt, but he did blast all of the interior, so yeah, it looks a lot better. Looks like we got some rain clouds rolling in here. Let's get this thing unloaded and get it in the shop before it starts raining, because you don't want to get this thing wet. Alright, so we've got the GTR inside the building. We can take our time and look this thing over, and we don't have to worry about it getting rained on outside. And gotta say, at first glance, this thing looks amazing. It looks a million times better than it did before it went to the blaster. All the burnt and charcoalness is gone. It's all fresh, clean metal now. Let's check this thing out. So this is where the major fire was on the car, and you can see it all cleaned up really well. Now there wasn't much fire damage here, but basically we stripped it all down. You can see inside here, the sandblasting leaves all the seam sealer. Over there was burnt up pretty good. It's all fresh metal there. Even up inside here. So yeah. Now, as I said outside, we will be stripping the paint off of this. I'm going to be using an orbital DA with 80 grit sandpaper to get this stripped off. You can see inside the trunk here. See, there's a lot of sand still left in this, so we're going to be flipping this thing over on the rotisserie. Try to get most of that sand out before we start painting. Now, while I'm sanding this paint off with the DA, it'll help vibrate the car on the rotisserie. Now, you can already tell some of the sand's already coming out of the car. Now, there were a couple spots, like you can see here, there was like a melted plastic there, and I kind of hit it with the wire wheel just to see if it would come off. I'm going to hit a couple spots like that that didn't come off with the blasting, but for the most part, this thing came really clean. Now, you can see where the seam sealer was removed from the fire, and then the blaster took the residue off. I'll be replacing that seam sealer after we get some primer on this thing. Let's flip this thing over and check out the bottom. Alright, so as you can see here, bottom side looks just as good as the top side. Like I said, all the seam sealer that stayed is in good shape. Anywhere that it got hot and cooked the seam sealer off, I'll just replace it there. But yeah, this thing looks really good. So let's spin this thing a couple times, 360, get as much of the sand residue as we can out of it, and I'll go ahead and start stripping the rest of the paint off the quarter panels. So as you can see, just spinning the car over a few times, got a lot of media, or sand if you will, to come out of the car. It just kind of sprinkles the floor there, but there's still a lot left in there. But while we're sanding on the quarter panels with the DA on the 80 grit, the vibration of the sander should knock a lot more of that sand out. So we're going to get our respirator on so we don't have to breathe the dust, and we're going to put some gloves on because it's very important not to touch the bare metal with bare hands, because the oil and salt in your skin will actually leave fingerprints on the car, and the fingerprints will start to rust. And rust is a bad thing to have on a bare metal car. So let's get some gloves on, get a respirator on, and start DAing these quarters and getting them stripped. So let me show you what I'm going to be sanding these quarter panels with to strip all the paint off of them. I'm going to be using this Zoda orbital buffer. Now, you might be saying, why is he going to use a buffer to strip a car, to sand a car with? And the short answer is, it works really well. I've also got some new sandpaper here that I'm going to be trying out. It's some might, and it's 80 grit, and this is a hook it. So I'm going to stick it to the pad of the orbital buffer, and we're going to strip these quarter panels. Alright, so we've got the other quarter panel stripped, so now let's move on to this one. Get all this white paint sanded off. Now, the orbital buffer works the best, and I tried wire wheel. I tried just a regular DA, which is basically a smaller orbital buffer, and on 80 grit, and both of those things worked okay, but this worked well also, and this is a high-speed buffer with some 36 grit on it. The problem with this one is it generates a lot of heat, and it can warp up the metal. So I figured I would try that orbital buffer and see what it did, and it worked really well. So we're going to continue using that on this quarter panel. Alright, so we've got all the paint stripped off of both of these quarter panels, and I've spun this thing around on the rotisserie more than a few times and took an air blower and tried to blow out all the crevices to get as much of this media out of the car as possible. You don't want this stuff blowing around in the car while you're spraying on primer and or paint. Now I'm going to go around the car one more time, check all my edges, make sure there's nothing else I need to sand, and then we're going to load this thing in the booth and start spraying on some epoxy primer. Alright, so we've got the car in the booth. And as you can see here on the floor, this is all the media, or sand if you will, that came out of the car. And you would think that that would be it, like that's all of it. But on the contrary, there's still some left in the car. I've got it in the booth. It's very minimal what's in the car, and to be honest, it's tough to get all the media out of the car. Now I'm going to spin this thing over a couple more times because we think we've got it all out because it's all on the floor here, but I guarantee you we'll blow it off inside the booth and there'll still be a little bit of residue. So we're going to spend a little bit more time blowing inside the booth, and then we're going to get ready to start spraying some epoxy. So let's get these booth doors closed and get this thing ready. So this is the epoxy primer we're going to be using on the GTR. This is Delphi's line Essential, and it's the ESU 430. That's the hardener, and that's the primer. These mix 1-to-1, and they do have a 15-minute induction period. So we have to mix it up, stir it up, and then let it sit for 15 minutes before we spray it. Alright, so we've got the epoxy primer mixed up. It calls for a 15-minute induction period, so while we're waiting on that, I'm going to let you guys in on a little tip. If you're spraying a material or a paint that you've never sprayed before, they've got this thing called P pages, and I can look them up on my mixing computer, but if you don't have access to a mixing computer, you can look it up on any computer via Google. So in this case, you would actually Google Delphi Essentials ESU 430 P sheets, and then it should pull up. The first thing it pulls up should be a PDF. You can click on that PDF, and you'll get a sheet of paper basically listing out everything about this paint. It'll give you flash times, it'll give you mixing ratios, if there's an induction period needed, it'll tell you what pressure to spray it at with what type of gun. It tells you anything and everything you need to know to use this material. So that's a good tip to have if you ever spray anything that you've never sprayed before. So I think we've given this stuff time. It's been about 15 minutes. Let's go ahead and spray this on the car. Alright, so we've got our gray epoxy sprayed on here. Let's look this thing over. It looks like everything is covered really well. And this light gray matte finish actually looks pretty cool on the car. I bet you guys are starting to wonder, what colors are going to paint this thing? So you're not going to have to wait too much longer because the next step is putting color on it. Alright, so we've got our epoxy sprayed on there. It says we need to give it an hour to flash off before we start applying top coat. So, got an hour to kill. Let's go do something productive. Alright, so it's been about an hour. We've got a lot of stuff accomplished while we're waiting on this epoxy to flash off before we can put our color on. And I know you guys are wondering what color this thing's going. We're going to be painting this thing white. So let's go ahead and get some white single stage sprayed on there. That's a lot of real estate on that thing. So I've got everything painted white that I wanted to. Now I did not paint the quarter panels. I just left those in the epoxy gray because there is some repair work that I need to do to those before I paint them. So everything looks really good. Let's go in there and check it out.
You don't really realize how old you are until you sit on the floor and then try to get up.
Alright, so that's going to be about it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We finally got some paint on this GTR. This thing's really starting to come along. We've got a lot accomplished, but we still have a lot left to do. We need to get the quarter panels repaired and painted. We also need to get this thing seam sealed and put a roof skin on this thing. Once those things are done, we can start swapping over the parts. And speaking of parts, I have sourced a parts car for this thing, and I need to make a video about that for you guys, so stay tuned for those videos. I want to thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. See ya!